Rich boy feeds homeless black girl for years. She becomes a doctor and saves his life. In a city where wealth builds walls and poverty is ignored, a single act of kindness can change everything. Ethan Sinclair, a privileged boy with a life of luxury, crosses paths with Maya Carter, a homeless girl, fighting to survive. One day, moved by something he can't explain, Ethan offers her food. He doesn't know it yet, but that small gesture will spark a connection neither time nor distance can erase. Years later, fate plays its cruel hand. This time, it's Ethan who needs saving, but when he opens his eyes in a hospital bed, the last person he ever expected to see stands before him. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. This is another heart-touching story from Living Narratives, where real emotions bring life's deepest reflections. Ethan walked aimlessly through the busy streets of downtown, his eyes drifting between the glittering storefronts and the anonymous faces that passed each other without acknowledgement. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, just that he felt the weight of his own existence pressing down on him, suffocated by the predictability of a life where everything was handed to him effortlessly. His daily routine consisted of luxury cars, rehearsed meetings, and social events filled with people who smiled out of convenience rather than sincerity. But in the middle of the endless flow of strangers, something caught his attention. Near a dumpster, sitting on the cold concrete sidewalk, was a girl. Her clothes were worn, her hair tied back carelessly, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, as if trying to disappear into herself. She wasn't begging, didn't stretch out her hand, didn't even glance at the passing pedestrians the way so many others did. What struck him the most was her eyes, deep, wary, alert. The kind of eyes that had seen far more than they should have, that carried silent stories and invisible scars. Without thinking twice, Ethan crossed the street and walked into a nearby deli, buying a packaged sandwich and a bottle of water. Before approaching the girl, she looked up as his shadow cast over her. She said nothing, but her dark eyes locked onto his, analyzing every detail, every unspoken intention. Ethan crouched down, keeping a bit of distance so as not to startle her, and held out the sandwich without ceremony. "Here, you must be hungry." Her reaction was immediate, though subtle. Her brows knitted slightly and her shoulders tensed, as if she were expecting some kind of trick hidden in that simple offer. Silence stretched between them for long moments, before Maya, hesitating, reached out and took the sandwich with swift fingers, almost as if she feared he might change his mind. "You don't have to thank me," Ethan said, watching as she unwrapped the food with a mix of care and urgency. "I just thought it might help." The first bite was small, as if she were still assessing the situation, but as soon as the taste hit her, her eyes betrayed the indifferent front she had been holding. For a brief moment, Ethan saw something flicker in them, a glimpse of vulnerability, before she quickly masked it again. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. The question caught Ethan off guard. He didn't have a concrete answer, wasn't sure what had drawn him here or why he had felt the need to extend a hand to this particular girl. "Because I wanted to," he replied simply, shrugging. Maya studied him for a long moment before looking down at the sandwich, taking another smaller bite, as if she still expected this to be some kind of cruel joke. "Nobody does anything for free," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. Her words carried a weight Ethan couldn't quite decipher, but he felt them hit him like a punch to the stomach. "Well, maybe I'm the exception," he countered, attempting a small smile. There was no response, only the quiet crinkle of the paper as she gripped what was left of the sandwich a little tighter. Ethan felt an urge to stay, to ask more, to understand how someone so young had ended up in this situation. But he knew that too many questions might push her away, so he remained silent, just watching as she ate. Maya finished each bite with caution, as if still doubting that the food was truly meant for her. Her eyes avoided his whenever he tried to make eye contact for more than a few. Seconds, there was something about her that intrigued him, something beyond the obvious misery of her circumstances. The way she held her head up, as if refusing to completely surrender to her situation, contrasted with the raw reality surrounding her. "Do you always stay here?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. This time, she looked at him directly, and he noticed the intelligence behind her wariness. "Depends on the day," she answered vaguely. "And who's around?" He understood what she meant. The world wasn't kind to people like her. "Well, if you ever need more food, I usually pass. Through here every day after school." He wasn't sure why he had said that. It hadn't been part of any plan. But when he saw the brief flicker of surprise cross her face, he knew he had touched something. She didn't respond immediately, only lowered her gaze, her fingers playing with the crumpled plastic of the wrapper. Ethan didn't push. He had already learned that some barriers took time to break down. "Thanks for the sandwich," she finally said, almost in a whisper. There was no enthusiasm in her voice, but there was no hostility either. It was a start. "You're welcome," Ethan replied, feeling an unexpected warmth at hearing those words. He slowly got to his feet, taking a step back before turning around and walking away, back to his comfortable, predictable world. But as he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had changed, even if he couldn't quite put a name to it yet. Ethan crossed the street without hesitation, holding another sandwich and a bottle of juice. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to return, but the image of Maya, alone and guarded, had lingered in his mind since the previous day. As he approached the same spot where he had found her, before, he saw that she was still there, sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes scanning everything around her. When she noticed him, her expression shifted slightly. It wasn't surprise or fear, but rather a mixture of caution and curiosity. "You came back," she said, not as a statement of fact, but as if she wasn't yet convinced of it. Ethan shrugged and extended the sandwich toward her. "I guess I did." Maya looked at the food, then at him, evaluating the gesture with the same hesitation as before. But this time, she took less time to accept it. She grabbed the sandwich from his hands, still without thanking him, but the tension in her shoulders seemed slightly less rigid. He sat down on the curb, maintaining a respectful distance. "You don't have to look at me like I'm some kind of alien," he joked, trying to ease the moment. Maya bit into the sandwich with less caution than before, which told him that at the very least, she was starting to believe he wasn't there with bad intentions. "People don't usually come back," she murmured between bites, keeping her gaze averted. Ethan frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if debating whether to answer, then finally said, "People like you show up, give something, and disappear. Some do it to ease their conscience, others to make themselves feel good for a moment, but no one ever comes back." There was a hardness in her voice, as if she had long since learned not to expect anything different. Ethan remained silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He had never thought about it that way before. What was a simple act of kindness for him was an anomaly in her world. "Maybe I just don't like leaving things unfinished," he said, watching her closely. Maya let out a short, humorless laugh. "This isn't a project, Sinclair. I'm not something you fix and then move on." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest at her words. "That's not what I meant," he replied sincerely. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher him. Finally, she sighed and continued eating. "Do you have a name other than Sinclair?" Ethan smirked slightly, surprised that she was finally asking something about him. "Ethan," Maya nodded, still chewing, and then said, "I'm Maya, but I guess you already knew that." He nodded. "Yeah, and now you know mine." She didn't respond right away, but something about her posture seemed less rigid. Ethan realized that despite her distrust, she was allowing herself to engage with him. It was progress, even if small. "Do you always stay here?" he asked, more to keep the conversation going than out of real curiosity. Maya shrugged. "Not exactly, but this place is safe enough." Ethan noticed the weight of those words. Safe enough, not safe, just enough to not be worse than other places. He wanted to ask more, to understand how she had ended up here, but he knew that too many direct questions could push her away. "I brought some juice too," he said, shifting the subject and holding out the bottle. Maya hesitated before taking it. "Do you always go around giving food to strangers?" she questioned, raising an eyebrow. Ethan laughed. "Not really. You're the first." Maya watched him for a moment, then looked away. Weird, he couldn't help but smile. "So I've been told." The conversation became more natural after that. She didn't talk much, but she was willing to answer simple questions. Ethan learned that Maya had once been in school before ending up on the streets. "Were you good at school?" he asked, curious. Maya lowered her gaze to the bottle of juice in her hands, turning it slightly between her fingers. "Very." There was pride in her voice, but also bitterness. "But I couldn't keep going. Life has a funny way of pulling you back just when you think you're moving forward." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "If you had a choice, would you go back?" She lifted her eyes to his, and this time there was something different in her expression. "Of course. I never wanted to stop." Ethan realized in that moment that Maya wasn't just someone trying to survive. She had ambitions, dreams that had been ripped away from her. And for some reason he didn't yet fully understand. He felt a genuine desire to help her, not out of pity, but because he saw something in her that maybe no one else had bothered to notice. "Maybe one day you will," he said simply. Maya laughed, but it wasn't a bitter laugh like before. "You say that like it's easy," he shrugged. "Maybe it's not, but it's not impossible either." She didn't reply, just watched him for a moment before finally murmuring, "We'll see." Ethan didn't push. He knew that trust was something built slowly. But that day, as he got up and said goodbye, he realized that Maya's eyes weren't as guarded as before. And for him, that was enough reason to keep coming back. Ethan stepped through the front doors of his family's mansion, barely acknowledging the staff as he made his way toward the grand staircase. He had spent another evening with Maya, sitting by her usual spot, talking about everything and nothing. It had become routine, something he looked forward to, more than he cared to admit. But tonight, there was an unfamiliar tension in the air. The moment he entered the house, he felt it, a weight pressing down on his chest, an unspoken warning in the way the butler glanced at him before quickly looking away. He barely had time to process it before he heard his father's voice. "Where the hell have you been?" Richard Sinclair's voice cut through the vast foyer like a whip, sharp and controlled, yet filled with an unmistakable edge of fury. Ethan stopped mid-step, his hand gripping the railing of the staircase as he turned to face his father. The older man stood near the grand piano, a glass of whiskey in hand, his expression carved from stone. Ethan had seen that look before, calculated, dangerous. He had learned long ago that his father rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His words alone carried the weight of consequence. "Out," Ethan answered, deliberately vague. He wasn't foolish enough to assume Richard would let it go, but he wasn't about to hand him information freely either. Richard took a slow sip of his drink, his piercing eyes locked onto Ethan like a predator sizing up prey. "Out," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Do you think I'm blind, Ethan, that I don't notice when my own son starts disappearing at odd hours?" He set the glass down on the marble counter beside him and took a step closer. "Or did you think I wouldn't have you followed?" Ethan felt his stomach twist, but he refused to let it show on his face. So that was it. He had been caught. Or at least, Richard had enough suspicion to take action. Ethan squared his shoulders, his voice calm but firm. "I don't answer to you, not about this." Richard's expression darkened. "Oh, but you do," his father countered smoothly, his tone low and cutting. "You are a Sinclair, Ethan. That name is more than just yours. It carries weight, it carries power, and it carries expectations. Expectations you are actively defying by spending your time with—" He paused, his lips curling in distaste. "A street rat." The way he said it made Ethan's blood boil. The casual cruelty of it, the absolute certainty that Maya was nothing more than an inconvenience, a stain on their polished reputation. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay calm. "Her name is Maya," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. Richard let out a humorless chuckle. "I don't give a damn what her name is," he said, picking up his glass again and swirling the amber liquid. "What I care about is the fact that my son is seen fraternizing with a homeless girl like some misguided saint. Do you have any idea how damaging that is? How the press would twist that? The rumors? The speculation?" He shook his head, a look of disgust flashing across his face. "You are the future of this family, Ethan. You do not get to jeopardize everything for a passing whim." Ethan took a step forward, his jaw tight. "She's not a whim," he said, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "And I won't stop seeing her just because you think it'll ruin your perfect little world." Richard sighed, as if truly disappointed. He reached into the pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a folded piece of paper, tossing it onto the counter. "Then I suppose she'll have to disappear," he mused, almost to himself. Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for the paper, unfolding it with hesitant fingers. It was an address, a run-down part of town, nowhere near where Maya usually stayed. His breath caught as realization dawned on him. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard merely smirked. "Nothing, yet." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something colder. "But I will. If you insist on continuing this foolishness, then I'll do whatever is necessary to put an end to it." Ethan's hands trembled as he crumpled the paper in his fist. He had known his father was ruthless, but this was something else. A direct threat, a warning wrapped in silk and poison. Maya had no idea that a storm was about to hit her, and it was all because of him. He felt trapped, torn between two worlds that could never coexist. But one thing was clear. His father had just declared war. Ethan would have to fight back before it was too late. Maya knew something was wrong the moment she noticed the two men standing across the street, watching her. They were dressed too well to belong in this part of town. Pressed slacks, polished shoes, jackets that screamed money. But it wasn't their appearance that sent a chill down her spine. It was their stillness. People in these streets always had somewhere to go, something to do, but these men stood as if they had all the time in the world, waiting, watching, and she knew exactly who had sent them. She tried to act natural, keeping her eyes down as she gathered her few belongings, a tattered blanket, an old backpack, the book Ethan had given her just a week ago. But as she slung the backpack over her shoulder and took a step away, they moved, smoothly, deliberately, like predators finally closing in on prey. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair, stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. "You're Maya Carter, right?" His voice was calm, too polite, which only made her more afraid. She didn't answer, just glanced at the alley behind her, calculating whether she could outrun them. But the second man, shorter and broader, took a step to block her from that direction as, "Well, we need to have a little chat," the first man continued, as if this were a friendly conversation. "I don't know you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "And I don't talk to strangers." She made another move to step around them, but the shorter man reached out and grabbed her arm, not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to let her know she wasn't going anywhere. "See, that's the problem," he said, his voice lower, almost amused. "You've been talking to someone you shouldn't." Maya's stomach twisted. There was no doubt anymore. This was about Ethan. "Look, I don't know what you think, but The taller man cut her off with a small sigh. "This isn't up for discussion," he said. "Mr. Sinclair wants you gone, and trust me, it'll be a lot easier for everyone if you just disappear on your own." Maya yanked her arm free, taking a step back. "And if I don't?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. The taller man exchanged a glance with his partner before shaking his head. "Then we make sure you do," he said simply. "No threats, no shouting, just a quiet, undeniable certainty that chilled her to the bone. Maya knew better than to believe they were bluffing. Richard Sinclair was not the kind of man who made empty threats. If she stayed, she wouldn't just be putting herself in danger, she'd be putting Ethan in danger too, and she couldn't let that happen. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded slowly. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go." The men watched her for a moment, as if deciding whether to believe her. Then, without another word, they stepped aside, giving her space to walk away. But as she did, she knew she wasn't just leaving this place. She was leaving Ethan. The thought nearly broke her. He had given her hope, had made her believe in something better. But Richard had made it clear, hope wasn't enough. She had no choice. Ethan arrived at their usual spot the next day, a bag of food in one hand, his phone in the other. He was late, but he knew Maya wouldn't mind. She'd probably make some sarcastic comment about rich people always being on their own time. He smiled at the thought, but as he reached the alley, his smile faded. The spot where Maya always sat was empty. No sign of her blanket, her backpack, nothing. A pit formed in his stomach, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe she had just moved. Maybe she'd be back soon. But as he took a step forward, something caught his eye. A small piece of paper fluttering slightly against the pavement. He bent down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The handwriting was small, hurried, as if written under pressure. "I had no choice." That was all it said. Ethan stared at the words, his mind racing. No choice. What the hell did that mean? His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he looked around, as if expecting Maya to suddenly reappear and explain everything. But there was nothing, just silence. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number, only to hear it go straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Desperation clawed at his chest as he turned in circles, scanning every face, every corner. She was gone, and deep down, he knew this wasn't a coincidence. Richard. His father had done this. Ethan clenched the note so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had underestimated his father's ruthlessness, had foolishly believed that Richard would let this go. But Richard Sinclair never let anything go. And now, Maya was paying the price. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. He wouldn't let this be the end. He had to find her. He had to fix this, no matter what it took. Maya kept her head down as she stepped through the entrance of the shelter, her fingers tightening around the strap of the old backpack slung over her shoulder. It was the only thing she had left now. The men Richard Sinclair had sent made it clear. She had no choice but to disappear. She had walked. She had. For hours, her body exhausted, her mind replaying every conversation she had ever had with Ethan. But no matter how many times she tried to justify staying, she knew the truth. If she had resisted, if she had stayed in that alley waiting for him, they wouldn't have stopped until she was truly gone. She couldn't risk it. Not for herself. Not for him. A woman at the front desk looked up, her expression a mixture of practiced indifference and weary kindness. "First time here?" she asked. Maya hesitated before nodding. The woman motioned for her to sign her name, but when Maya hesitated, she added, "Just a first name is fine." She scrawled Maya on the clipboard and handed it back. The woman gave a small nod. "We don't ask questions here. You need a bed?" Maya nodded again. "All right, we've got space for a few nights. We'll talk about long-term options in the morning." There was no warmth in her voice, but there was no judgment either. Just the same quiet, tired efficiency Maya had seen in so many faces before. People who had learned that kindness could be dangerous, that hope was a fragile thing. That night, lying on a stiff mattress in a room filled with other displaced souls, Maya stared at the ceiling and whispered a promise to herself. She would never go back to that alley. Never again would she rely on the kindness of strangers or wait for someone to save her. She would find a way out of this life, not by luck, not by chance, but by force. She had always been good at school, had always wanted more for herself. Now she would make sure no one could ever take her future away from her again. Ethan, on the other hand, was unraveling. He sat at the dining table across from his father, his jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. Richard was speaking, but Ethan barely heard him. Every word sounded like static, meaningless noise droning in the background. He hadn't slept in days, had barely eaten. The note Maya had left haunted him. I had no choice. He had read those words so many times that they were burned into his mind. His father had done this. He knew it, and yet there was nothing he could do. Richard controlled everything, his money, his future, his movements. Ethan had tried finding Maya, had searched every alley, every shelter, every place he thought she might go. But she had vanished, gone, without a trace, just like his father had wanted. "You're not even listening," Richard said, his tone edged with irritation. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes hollow and dark. "Why should I?" he asked flatly. Richard exhaled slowly, setting his silverware down with deliberate care. "Because I'm teaching you how to run an empire," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. "You're going to be the face of Sinclair Enterprises one day, whether you like it or not. It's time you started acting like it." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right. Because being a Sinclair means doing whatever the hell you want with people's lives." His father's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something sharp, assessing. "She was nothing, Ethan," he said, as if that was meant to be reassuring. "A distraction. I did you a favor." Ethan stood so fast, his chair scraped against the marble floor. "A favor?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "You tore someone out of my life like they were a piece of garbage, and you think you did me a favor?" Richard simply tilted his head, watching him. "You'll understand one day," he said, "when you stop thinking with your emotions and start acting like the man you were raised to be." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to turn away before he did something he couldn't take back. He stormed out, ignoring his father's voice calling after him, ignoring the way his mother barely looked up from her wineglass. Days passed. Then, weeks. Ethan stopped trying to find Maya. He stopped searching, stopped hoping. He was wasting his time. He knew that now. His father had made sure of it. Instead, he threw himself into his responsibilities, into the lifeless meetings and the endless demands of being Richard Sinclair's heir. But he wasn't the same. He no longer cared about the things that used to frustrate him, the shallow parties, the soulless transactions. None of it mattered. If this was the life his father had planned for him, then fine. He would play the part, but he would never forgive him. Maya, meanwhile, spent every waking hour studying. The shelter had a small resource center, nothing fancy, but it had books, and that was all she needed. She read textbooks cover to cover, filling every spare moment with knowledge. She had no money, no safety net, but she had her mind. That was the one thing no one could take from her. She studied for GED exams, preparing herself for the day she could leave this place behind for good. One evening, after finishing a practice test, she sat back and exhaled. She was exhausted, her body sore from long hours spent sitting on worn-out chairs, but she felt something she hadn't. Who felt in a long time, control. Her future was hers again. Not Ethan's, not Richard Sinclair's, hers. She would carve out a new path, one where she owed nothing to anyone. She would never be a lost girl in an alley again. This time, she would make sure no one had the power to take anything from her. Ever again. Maya leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as she closed the thick medical journal in front of her. The long hours at the hospital were beginning to take their toll. But exhaustion was a small price to pay for everything she had achieved. She had done it. She had made it through medical school, through the grueling internships, through the nights when she barely had enough to eat but refused to give up. Now she was a doctor, working long shifts in the emergency department of a well-respected hospital. It was everything she had fought for, yet something felt unfinished. No matter how many lives she saved, no matter how much she buried herself in her work, the past lingered at the edge of her mind, always threatening to resurface. She had worked so hard to erase the girl she once was, the girl who had slept on cold concrete and relied on the kindness of a boy who had once meant everything to her. Ethan Sinclair. His name hadn't passed her lips in years, but it had never truly left her mind. She had avoided thinking about him, convinced that remembering would only open wounds she had spent too long closing. Yet here she was, staring at her phone screen, her thumb hovering over an article that had popped up in her feed. Sinclair Enterprises expands into healthcare, CEO Ethan Sinclair to oversee new medical initiatives. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to see his name like this, so suddenly, so unavoidable. Ethan stared blankly at the view from his office, the city skyline sprawling beneath him like a world he no longer belonged to. He should have felt accomplished. After all, he had finally stepped into the role his father had always wanted for him. He was the CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, the face of a billion-dollar empire, the heir who had finally fulfilled his duty. But it all felt hollow. Every meeting, every deal, every polished handshake, it was all just a performance, a role he had perfected over the years. He had learned to wear the mask well, but beneath it, he felt nothing. There had been a time when he cared, a time when he had fought against becoming the man his father wanted him to be. But after Maya disappeared, something inside him had hardened. He had searched for her, had spent months trying to find any trace of where she had gone, but she had vanished without a word, leaving behind nothing but that small, crumpled note. "I had no choice." He had read those words so many times they had become a scar, a permanent reminder that some things were simply out of his control. Eventually, he had stopped looking. He had forced himself to believe that she had moved on, that she had built a life far away from his. And so he had done the same, or at least pretended to. Maya tapped her fingers against the table, staring at the article without really seeing it. Ethan Sinclair. He looked different in the photo, older, more refined. But his eyes were still the same piercing gaze that once held warmth, now filled with something colder, something distant. She wondered if he had changed as much as she had, if he still thought about her, if he had resented her for leaving without an explanation. She told herself it didn't matter. The past was the past. She had no reason to reach out, no reason to reopen a door that had long been closed, and yet she couldn't bring herself to close the article either. Ethan flipped through the latest financial reports, barely registering the numbers in front of him. He had been distracted all day, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't quite define. His assistant knocked on the door, stepping in cautiously. "Sir, the investors from the new healthcare initiative are expecting you at the press event this evening." Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Right, I'll be there." He didn't care about the event, didn't care about the company's move into the medical field, but it was his duty, and duty was all he had left. Maya finally forced herself to close the article, setting her phone down as she leaned back in her chair. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was coincidence, but either way, she wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever this meant. She had spent years rebuilding herself, creating a life where she owed nothing to anyone. But if fate was pulling her back toward Ethan Sinclair, she wasn't sure she could resist. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel so distant. It felt like it was catching up to her faster than she could outrun it. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he maneuvered the car down the winding road. His mind was a storm, filled with anger and frustration from yet another pointless evening of pretending to care about Sinclair Enterprises. The charity gala had been a performance, one he had perfected over the years, smiling at investors, making empty promises, pretending to be the man his father always wanted him to be. But tonight, the mask had cracked. One comment, just one, had shattered the fragile control he had maintained for so long. You're just like a father," one of the older board members had said with a knowing smirk, his words meant as a compliment. But to Ethan, they felt like chains locking around his wrists. He wasn't his father. He had spent his whole life trying not to be. And yet, here he was, wearing the same suits, speaking in the same measured tone, running the same empire built on control and power. He hated it. He hated the suffocating weight of expectations that had followed him since childhood. He hated that no matter how much he fought it, he had ended up exactly where Richard Sinclair had always wanted him to be. His grip tightened, his foot pressing harder on the gas. The road was empty, just like he wanted. He needed space, needed to breathe, needed something to remind him that he was still human and not just another cog in the Sinclair machine. He barely registered the headlights of an oncoming truck until it was too late. A flash of movement, the blare of a horn, the screech of tires, then impact. The world tilted, spun, shattered around him. Pain exploded in his chest as metal twisted and glass shattered, the force of the collision slamming his body forward. Darkness rushed in, cold and absolute, swallowing him whole. Maya barely had time to process the new emergency case being wheeled into the ER before she heard a nurse shout a name that made her blood freeze. Ethan Sinclair, male, late 20s, multiple trauma injuries, unconscious at the scene. The clipboard nearly slipped from her fingers. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to focus. "Vitals!" she snapped, stepping forward, pushing aside the wave of disbelief threatening to consume her. "BP is dropping, signs of internal bleeding, suspected rib fractures, possible head trauma," the paramedic responded. As they moved Ethan onto the gurney, Maya's eyes flickered to his face, bruised, bloodied, and too still. For a moment, the world threatened to spin out of control. She hadn't seen him in years, had spent so long convincing herself that their past was just that, past. And yet here he was, lying on an operating table, his life hanging in the balance, and she was the one tasked with saving him. "Let's move now," she ordered, pushing her emotions aside with years of disciplined practice. The team sprang into action, wheeling Ethan into surgery as Maya scrubbed in, forcing herself into the detached mindset she needed. This wasn't Ethan, the boy she once loved. This was just another patient, another life in her hands. And yet, as she picked up the scalpel, she couldn't ignore the tremble in her fingers or the memories crashing against the walls she had spent so long building. Hours passed in a blur of blood, stitches, and hushed orders. Every second felt like an eternity, but Maya didn't allow herself to hesitate. She repaired ruptured organs, stabilized his vitals, fought against the odds that seemed stacked against him. By the time she finally stepped back, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, Ethan was alive, barely, but alive. She let out a slow breath, her eyes lingering on his unconscious face. The years had changed him. His features were sharper, his jaw more defined, but he was still Ethan, still the boy who had once given her food when she had nothing, still the boy who had made her believe in something beyond survival. She didn't realize how tightly she was gripping the edge of the table until one of the nurses touched her arm. "Dr. Carter," Maya blinked, shaking herself free from the haze of memories. "He's stable," she said, her voice steady despite the storm. Raging inside her. "Move him to ICU. We'll monitor him closely." She turned away before anyone could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. As Ethan was wheeled away, Maya stayed behind, her hands trembling at her sides. She had thought she had moved on, had convinced herself that the past was buried. But fate had other plans. And now, no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she knew the truth. This was just the beginning. The operating room was a battlefield, and Maya was at war with time. Her hands moved with precision, her mind focused solely on the patient in front of her. The paramedics had done their job well. He had made it to the hospital alive, but barely. The trauma was extensive, internal bleeding, fractured ribs, a severe head injury. She had seen cases like this before, had spent years hardening herself against the weight of life and death decisions. But as she worked to stop the bleeding, something pulled at her consciousness. a whisper in the back of her mind that she couldn't ignore. She knew this face. Beneath the bruises, the swelling, the dried blood, there was something unmistakably familiar. For a brief moment she hesitated, her scalpel hovering over torn flesh. Recognition hit her like a blow to the chest, an impact far worse than any physical wound. Ethan Sinclair. The name echoed in her mind, loud and suffocating. Her breath caught, her vision blurred for half a second before she forced herself back to the task at hand. This wasn't the time. She wasn't Maya, the girl who had once depended on him, the girl who had disappeared from his life without an explanation. She was Dr. Carter. She had a job to do. She stitched his wounds, repaired the internal damage, stabilized his vital signs. Every movement was precise, every decision calculated. And yet, her hands trembled in a way they never had before. It had been years since she had last seen him, years since she had sworn never to look back. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. She had promised herself that she would never again be at the mercy of someone else's kindness, that she would never again feel powerless. And now, here he was, unconscious on her table, his life literally in her hands. When the surgery was finally over, Maya pulled off her gloves with slow deliberation, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She watched as Ethan was wheeled out of the room, the monitors beeping steadily, confirming that he had survived. But survival was not the same as safety. She knew he was still in danger, not just physically, but from the ghosts of their past that neither of them had ever truly buried. Hours later, she stood by his bedside in the ICU, arms crossed tightly over her chest. His face was still swollen, the bruises stark against his pale skin. But he was breathing. That was all that mattered. She had told herself she wouldn't stay, that once he was out of surgery, he was just another patient. But her feet had betrayed her, carrying her to his room without conscious thought. Ethan stirred, a faint groan slipping from his lips. His eyelashes fluttered, his fingers twitching slightly. Against the crisp hospital sheets, Maya took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was a mistake. She should leave before he woke up, before he could see her, before his eyes opened, unfocused at first, clouded with pain and disorientation. He blinked slowly, his gaze moving across the room before settling on her. And then, just as she took another step back, his lips parted. A single word escaped in a hoarse whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Maya. She froze. Time itself seemed to stop. The world shrank to the space between them, to the name that had left his. Lips like a memory, pulled from the depths of unconsciousness. Her mind screamed at her to turn, to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard it. But she couldn't move. She stood there, caught between the past and the present, between everything she had run from and everything she had tried to become. Ethan's gaze sharpened, confusion flickering into something stronger. Pain, recognition, the slow, dawning realization that this wasn't a dream, that the woman standing in front of him was real. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, but his eyes never left hers. "Is it really you?" His voice was weak, but the raw emotion in it was enough to send a fresh wave of unease crashing over her. Maya forced herself to breathe, to remember who she was now. "You need to rest," she said, her voice carefully controlled, clinical. "You're recovering from surgery. Try not to overexert yourself." She moved to check his IV line, needing something, anything, to keep her hands busy, to keep herself from drowning in the weight of his gaze. Ethan let out a shaky breath, wincing as he shifted slightly. "It's you," he repeated, as if saying it again would make it real. After all this time, his voice trailed off, but the emotion behind it remained, thick and heavy between them. Maya straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze head-on. "Get some rest, Ethan," she said, ignoring the way her name still lingered on his lips. "We'll talk later." And before he could say another word, before the past could fully wrap its claws around her, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions and a name that had never really left him. Ethan sat up in bed, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through his ribs. He had barely slept since waking up, but it wasn't just the injuries that kept him restless. It was her, Maya. After years of believing she had disappeared without a trace, she had been standing right there, hovering over him. With the same guarded expression he remembered, but she wasn't the same girl he had once known. The warmth in her eyes had been replaced with something colder, something distant, as if she had built an impenetrable wall between them. He needed answers, and this time she wouldn't walk away without giving them to him. When the door opened, he was ready. Maya stepped inside, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in her white coat, the very image of professionalism, but Ethan saw through it. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the pen she held. "You shouldn't be sitting up yet," she said, her voice clipped, almost rehearsed. Ethan ignored her concern. "Why did you leave?" His voice was rough, not just from injury, but from the weight of years without closure. Maya exhaled, setting the clipboard down. "Ethan, this isn't the time, isn't the—" "Then when?" he cut in, frustration clear in his voice. "You disappeared, no warning, no explanation, and now, after all this time, you're standing here like a stranger, acting like none of it ever happened." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair, wincing at the movement. "I looked for you, Maya. I spent months trying to find you, and all I ever got was that damn note." His eyes locked onto hers. "I had no choice. That's what you wrote. So tell me, what the hell does that mean?" Maya's fingers curled into fists at her sides. For years, she had imagined this conversation, had prepared herself for the moment he would demand the truth. She had thought she could keep it buried, that the past no longer held power over her. But standing here, looking at him, Ethan, the boy who had once been her lifeline, she realized that no amount of time had erased what had been stolen from them. "Your father," she finally said, her voice quieter than she intended. Ethan stilled, his jaw tightening. "What?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Your father sent people after me, told me to disappear, made it clear that if I didn't, things would get worse, for me and for you." Her voice wavered, but she refused to look away. "I didn't have a choice, Ethan, not if I wanted to survive." His hands clenched into fists against the sheets. Richard, of course. Ethan had known his father was ruthless, but to go this far, to destroy the one thing that had ever made him feel like himself. His blood boiled, rage climbing up his spine like fire. "And you just left?" His voice was raw, edged with anger but laced with something deeper, hurt. Maya's expression hardened. What was I supposed to do? Fight him? He had power, money, influence. I was just a homeless girl he wanted. "Out of the way!" Her voice cracked at the end, but she refused to let her emotions consume her. "I did what I had to do, Ethan. It was the only way to keep you safe." Ethan let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Safe? You think I was safe? You disappearing broke me, Maya. I became exactly what he wanted, a puppet, an empty shell, a Sinclair in name and action. And now you're telling me it was because of him." He swung his legs off the bed, forcing himself to stand, despite the pain. "I'm done." His voice was resolute, final. Maya frowned. "Done with what?" "With him." Ethan turned away, reaching for his phone. "I need to see him." Maya grabbed his arm before he could take another step. "Ethan, you just had surgery. You're not in any condition to—" He looked at her, something unshakable in his eyes. "I should have fought for you then, but I won't make the same mistake now, Richard." Sinclair barely looked up when his son stormed into his office, his usual air of indifference wrapped around him like armor. He sipped his drink, his expression unreadable. "I assume this visit isn't about business," he mused, placing his glass down. Ethan's chest burned, but not from his. Injuries? It was the rage, the betrayal that consumed him now. "You threatened her," he said, his voice steady despite the fury pulsing beneath it. "You forced her to leave." Richard exhaled, clearly unbothered. "You're going to have to be more specific, son." "I do a lot of things." Maya, Ethan, nearly growled the name. You tore her out of my life, had her threatened, destroyed something you had no right to touch." Richard leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "And yet, here you are, successful, powerful, exactly where you were always meant to be." He gestured vaguely. "It worked out, didn't it?" Ethan clenched his fists. "You had no right." "I had every right," Richard countered, standing now, his imposing frame just as sharp as ever. "You are my son, my legacy, and I did what was necessary to ensure you didn't throw it all away on some girl who would have dragged you down with her." The way he said it, so casually, so certain, made something inside Ethan snap. "She wasn't just some girl," he hissed. "She was the only real thing in my life, and you ripped her away from me." Richard's expression didn't change, but there was something almost amused in his eyes. "You're emotional," he said dismissively. "This is what she does to you, and that is exactly why I did what I did." He shook his head. "You were never meant for a life like that, Ethan. You are a Sinclair. You don't get to choose." Ethan took a slow breath, and then, with a calmness that was far more terrifying than any outburst, he said, "You're right about one thing." He stepped closer, his voice deadly quiet. "I am a Sinclair, but I'm not you." He met his father's gaze head on. "I quit." Richard blinked, for the first time showing something that almost resembled shock. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in it. "No, what's ridiculous is that I spent years letting you control me." He turned toward the door. "It's over. I won't live by your rules anymore." As he walked away, leaving his father standing in stunned silence, Ethan felt something lift off his chest for the first time in years. He had lost Maya once because of his father's control. He wouldn't lose her again. Not this time. Ethan stood in front of Maya's apartment door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had been standing there for several minutes, willing himself to knock, but the weight of everything that had come before held him still. He had faced ruthless businessmen, torn down everything his father had built, walked away from the empire that had been mapped out for him since birth. But this was harder than all of it. Maya had always been the one thing in his life that felt real, and now, after everything they had been through, he was finally here. He exhaled sharply and raised his, knocking twice. The sound barely faded before the door opened, and there she was. Maya's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her expression hardened into something unreadable. She was in her scrubs, a clipboard in her hand, clearly caught off guard by his presence. He had prepared himself for 1,000 different reactions: anger, resentment, indifference, but the silence that stretched between them was somehow worse. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice measured but cautious. He swallowed, suddenly feeling like the reckless teenager he had once been, standing in front of the girl who had always challenged him in ways no one else had. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice raw, honest. Maya exhaled, gripping the clipboard tightly as if grounding herself. "You shouldn't be here." She didn't say it with anger, but with exhaustion, as if she had spent too long convincing herself that this chapter of her life was over. Ethan stepped forward, but she didn't move, didn't let him in. "I know I shouldn't," he admitted, "but I had to come anyway." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration lacing his movements. "I walked away from everything, from my father, from that world. I did it for myself, but also because of you, because of what you meant to me, what you still mean to me." Her fingers tightened around the clipboard, her nails digging into the wood. "You don't know what I went through," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was steel beneath it. "You don't know what it was like to be ripped away from you, to be forced into a life I never wanted. And when I had nothing, no home, no protection, no one, I had to rebuild myself from the ground up, alone." Ethan's jaw clenched as her words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had spent years searching for her, wanting answers, but he had never truly considered the cost of what had happened to her. "I do know," he said, his voice steady now, "because I was alone too. I tried to find you. I spent months searching, asking questions, looking for anything that would lead me to you, but you were gone. And when I finally realized I had no way of reaching you, I let myself become the version of me my father wanted." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I told myself I didn't care anymore, that if you had really wanted to, you would have found me. But I was wrong. I should have fought harder, and when I saw you again, when I woke up in that hospital and heard your voice, I knew I couldn't walk away again." Maya's grip loosened on the clipboard, her defenses wavering. She had spent years telling herself that she didn't need him, that she had made the right choice, that she had survived without him, and she had. But as she looked into his eyes now, filled with the same unwavering determination she had once fallen for, she realized something terrifying. She still cared, and it wasn't just some lingering ghost of the past. It was real, tangible, alive inside her, no matter how hard she had tried to bury it. Ethan took a slow step closer, closing the distance between them. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," he said softly. "I don't expect anything, except for one thing. I don't want to live another day where you're just a memory." His voice was steady, but his eyes searched hers, waiting for a sign that she felt the same, that she wasn't just going to push him away again. Maya let out a slow, measured breath. "And if I let you back in?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "What then?" He didn't hesitate. "Then we figure it out, together. No more running, no more decisions being made for us. Just you and me choosing this, choosing us, because we want to." Maya felt something shift inside her, something breaking apart and reforming all at once. The years had been cruel, had stolen so much from them, but here he was, not the boy she had once loved, but the man who had walked away from everything for the chance to stand in front of her now. And she knew, deep down, that she had never stopped wanting him. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for his hand, and when their skin met, a flood of memories came rushing back. The nights they had spent talking about a future they had never gotten to have. The way he had always looked at her, like she was something worth fighting for. The way it had felt to lose him. But not this time. Not again. She laced her fingers through his, squeezing gently. "This time," she said, her voice steady and sure, "no one can take this away from us." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had finally found home. They didn't know what the future held, didn't know what obstacles still lay ahead, but what they did know, what they were certain of, was that this time they wouldn't let go, not for anything. Every story we share here on Living Narratives is created with care and dedication just for you. What did this story mean to you? Leave us a comment. We love reading your thoughts and connecting with you. If this video touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Your support helps us continue bringing special stories your way. It truly makes a difference. Thank you for being part of our journey, and we'll see you in the next video.